starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series. My name is Joshua Stafford. I'm with the USGS Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at South Dakota State University, and I'll be monitoring today's webinar. The general format of the webinar will be 40 to 45 minutes of presentation by our speaker, followed by about 15 minutes of questions from the participants. Also, please be aware that we'll announce the next webinar at the end of the session, and we are generally following a monthly schedule. Okay. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping announcements. Just to familiarize you with the GoToMeeting screens, there's an attendee control panel where you can control the audio for the webinar. You can use audio through your computer or telephone and can consult the directions in the audio pane on how to do that. At any time during the presentation, you can type questions that you want to ask the speaker, and you use the questions pane to do that. As the moderator, during the Q&A time, I will read the questions to the presenter so that everyone can hear the questions clearly. Also, I want to note that all attendee phone lines are on mute to cut out the background noises and distractions. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording following the webinar. We also ask that you take a moment to complete the evaluation survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. That will help us plan future events. If you'd like a copy of today's slides, please find a PDF copy in the handout section of the control pane. And if you're really tech savvy and you want to tweet about today's webinar, please use, and I'm not tech savvy, but looks like hashtag SWSwebinar. I'd like to test the questions pane and at the same time get a little demographic info by having everyone type the state or country you're participating from and how many people are viewing the webinar with you. So if some of you folks could do that and type it into the questions pane. Okay, great. I'm seeing folks from Florida, from Texas, from Georgia, Colorado, Minnesota, and another from Minnesota. My neighbors. Hi, everybody. I can wave at you. Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Washington. Looks like we've got folks from all over. So with those logistics out of the way, let's get our webinar started. It's my pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Christina Eisenberg. Christina is the Chief Scientist at Earthwatch Institute, where she directs a citizen science research program that is addressing global change. She leads a long-term ecological restoration research program in Waterton Lakes National Park, Alberta, involving fire, apex predators, and bison. And with that, Christina, feel free to take control and give us your presentation.
Thank you, Josh. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for inviting me to give this webinar. I'm going to start by speaking a little bit about community ecology. So in this era of global change, we are, whether we're researchers or managers, we're working hard to try to help create more resilient communities. And so major drivers of resiliency in all communities, from wetlands to prairies to alpine areas, are processes. So very fundamental processes such as nutrient flow, the carbon cycle, disturbance, the sort of disturbance with which these communities that involve plants and animals have co-evolved, predation, and I highlight that because that is the underlying theme of today's talk, is the role of these apex predators, the Trophic Cascades, and pollination. Now, anthropogenic influences have modified the world tremendously. Some say that there is no place on the earth that contains its original assemblages of communities of flora and fauna that might have been present, let's say, 1,000 years ago. big issue are human modifications that were done in the last century before we really knew what we were doing by moving around species, bringing in non-native species, and some of them have made the leap into invasive species because none of the other components of that community had co-evolved with those species and had no defenses against them. But the outcome of these processes of restoring nutrient flow, restoring disturbance regimes, restoring food web relationships such as predation and pollination, eliminating non-native invasive species is an increase in biodiversity. So why biodiversity matters is because climate change is causing an uptick in extinction. Somewhere between, models vary, but the IPCC, based on IPCC models, scientists are projecting that 35% of the species that we have worldwide today will be extinct by 2100. By 2200, 50% will be extinct. All of these processes that I just mentioned, what they do is that they increase biodiversity in a system. And so as we're facing things like drought and stresses on habitat caused by climate change, systems that have a higher baseline of biodiversity are going to be a lot more resilient to those stressors. So I'm going to go over the fundamentals of trophic cascades. There's two ways of looking at the world, the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. And there was a raging debate about this in the 1960s, sparked by Aspen et al., countered by. Today we're still reconciling this argument, and that's another theme that runs through today's talk. So the ecosystems have, any ecosystem, whether you're talking about a marine one or a wetland or a tropical forest, these are the building blocks of any ecosystem are energy, plants, herbivores, and predators. And the bottom-up perspective is that energy from the sun makes plants grow, and so energy from the sun moving from the bottom up, actually, because this is energy that goes into the soil. Energy makes plants grow. Plants then provide food for herbivores, from insects to large mammals, and that in turn sustains predators. So that's the bottom-up approach view of ecosystems. The top-down view is that predators are driving the whole thing, and so if you remove the predators, the whole system falls apart. And so predators control herbivores via the act of predation and also by scaring them. People have found fear-based responses by herbivores in invertebrates, such as Auschwitz work with spiders in old field ecosystems that he's manipulated experimentally. So predators control herbivores, herbivores that are lower in density and also having to be a lot more wary, consume plants in a more sustainable manner. And then that causes increased plant growth, greater biomass of plants, and also the act of predation helps cycle energy through that system via the carbon cycle more vigorously. So those are the two perspectives. My argument is that we don't live in a bimodal world. Nothing is that simple, and certainly ecology isn't. Ecology is a tangled bank. And while predators are very important, community structure is shaped from the bottom up and from the top down, And this type of top-down, bottom-up argument has been put forward by Polis and a few other people. But this is still an argument that's very much at play in ecology, and it's also one that one must consider if one is trying to restore ecosystems and restore some of those processes that I started out talking about. So Trophic Cascades concepts, the top-down perspective is not new. The first time it was articulated was by Sir Charles Elton. He's the fellow who essentially created most of the concepts we use in ecology. He was 27 years old. He wrote the book Animal Ecology, which I highly recommend. I recommend it to, it's required reading for all my students. In it, he talks about things like the food pyramid and most of the tenets of ecology, the role of disturbance, cycling of energy, that are an integral part of how we do ecology today. So in this book, there's a chapter where he talks about wolf removal and deer exploding in number, and he uses the Grand Canyon, the Kaibab Plateau, as an example of an ecological collapse. He was a friend and mentor to Aldo Leopold, who many of you, and certainly those of you in Madison, Wisconsin, are aware of the work that he did. And he noted as early, well, he attended a conference that Elton was at in the late 1920s, and from that point on, it was a conference on predation and animal cycling. Aldo Leopold started writing about the role of wolves and other large carnivores in improving ecological function. And he wrote journal articles about this in the 30s and 40s, and he did a wildlife survey for the federal government as an independent consultant in the late 1920s to early 1930s. He found that everywhere that apex predators had been removed, these ecosystems were functioning in a suboptimal level. Basically, herbivores had exploded in number. They were wiping out the plant communities and eliminating habitat for other species such as game birds in the process. Terborg and Estes wrote a book that I recommend, Trophic Cascades, published in 2010, and that's a pretty scholarly treatise on trophic cascades, which occur worldwide in all kinds of ecosystems. And I wrote a book about this in 2010. Both of those books are published by Island Press. So the act of predation is an important ecological process. It has been identified starting with Sir Charles Elton, going on through Aldo Leopold, and now more recently with things like the wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone. And it is one of several processes that help maintain ecological resiliency. And this can mitigate climate change. So what is an apex predator? Well, that is a bull trout. In marine food webs, it's a carnivore. In any system, is an apex predator that typically preys on a particular species that is an herbivore. And that act of predation keeps its preferred prey in species in check. So in a marine food web, you've probably heard about the sea otter is an apex predator. It preys on sea urchins. Urchins are herbivores that consume kelp. When you remove that apex predator, the sea otter, the urchins multiply to the point, and nothing else preys that effectively on them, that they wipe out kelp forests, and those areas are actually referred to by ecologists as urchin barrens because they resemble a desert ecologically. And this other images of a wolf in the Lamar Valley They use the riparian areas and the wetlands. Wolves tend to use those wetlands because it's an easy place for them to take down prey, basically. But the idea is that wolves, by controlling their preferred prey, which is in Yellowstone, it's the elk, are restoring these wetlands because fewer elk, and also elk that have to always stay on the move to avoid getting preyed on, are going to give willows a break, and also trees like aspen and cottonwoods that grow on the stream banks. So Keystone Effects. This is a Roman arch, and those of you who have been to Europe know that, in the UK know that these arches, they're not mortared in place. They were held together by pressure exerted from the stone at the very top of that arch. And if you remove that stone, the whole arch falls apart. So Robert Payne, an ecologist at the University of Washington, he did seminal work on the Trophic Cascades concept in the starting in the mid-60s, and he created the term Trophic Cascade. Trophic means food, and a cascade is like a waterfall. So these food web relationships that involve energy moving from the top down, from that apex predator down. And he also created the keystone term. So he referred to the wolf or the sea otter or other similar species as a keystone predator. I interviewed him when I wrote my book on Trophic Cascades, and he said he wishes he could take that term back because he intended it to be very specifically to refer to a predator, not to bison, or, you know, it's even been used to refer to Douglas firs in the Pacific Northwest. But it's a very compelling term, and words carry a lot of power in that they create images in people's heads, from scientists to lay people. So this paper was published in Science. This is S. Jim Estes, the sea otter scientist, was the lead author. This was published very recently, I believe in 2013, 2014. The title is Trophic Downgrading of Planet Earth. And the authors went through ecosystems worldwide and noted how everywhere that an apex predator had been removed, the whole system had been downgraded ecologically, and one of the key signals was elimination of a reduction in biodiversity. And these systems that were downgraded were less resilient ecologically. So this occurred in the Arctic with the Arctic fox, which was removed for basically the fur trade. And there was a major shift in the plant community. Basically, grasses took over where there used to be lichen. And these relationships are quite complex, and I don't have time to go into each of them. If you're interested in this, I highly recommend this paper or reading the Terborg and Estes book on the Cascades. Image B is Lagoguri, Venezuela, and where an area was dammed, creating islands of various sizes, from very, very small, like the size of an office room, sized room, to islands that were thousands of hectares in size. And the small islands were too small to sustain predators. And what happened was, without these apex predators, eventually the ants took over, and the herbivores ruled that system. And you can see the paired images. The image on the right is of a large island, and you can see that understory. And the image on the right is an island that was inhabited by jaguars and cougars as well. And so what happens is that the diversity of songbirds plummeted by 90% in that system. The next image is of Yellowstone, and I'm going to speak more in detail about that in a little bit. but essentially the wolf's return is credited with returning shrubs like willows to, their former height. Wildebeest on the Serengeti as well. They're not an apex, they're not a predator, but they are considered a keystone species that keeps grasslands open. In their absence, woody species start to take over. The sea otter, and this is an image on the left, that is a sea urchin barren. So you can see how extreme the difference is from a system lacking sea otters to one that has them. And kelp provide habitat for myriad species of fish, plankton. Just the shift in biodiversity, again, is about 90%. On the California coast, this is an image from Bob Payne's work, and those are mussels. And what happens is the sea star is the apex predator, and when it's been removed, and he removes them experimentally, what happens is that these mussels take over. In the image below that, see Long Lake, Michigan, that's a wide-mouthed bass, and that is the apex predator in that system. And what you get when you remove that species by overfishing is you get eutrophication, so algal blooms, and the system becomes a lot less productive. And again, these are very multi-level food web relationships, that cascade down or up, and they're quite complex, and they're very well elucidated in the Turborganesky's book. In a coral reef, you get the same type of effects when you remove that top level of predator, sharks, for example. And in a stream in Oklahoma, again, when you remove those large carnivorous fish, this is bass again, you can see the difference in the stream conditions. So for my own research, I wanted to know what effect wolves would have on ecosystems and what effects would they have in wetlands. So I'm in this image on the bottom, that's me in the far corner. I'm standing in a wetland in Glacier National Park. It's a wet meadow, and it's a meadow that was recolonized by wolves. There's actually a wolf den behind me on that slope, about half a kilometer up that slope. It also, as you can see, burned severely. The fire occurred in 2006. So the question is, the fire is a bottom-up effect. It causes a flow of energy through that system via nutrient flow and increases growth for species that are adapted to it. But again, this is a place where wolves returned, and there's a wolf den. They're very active. When that picture was taken, there was a pack of 17 wolves living there. And spending most of its time in that meadow, I had radio collars on them. So I wanted to know how do all of these effects, the top-down ones and the bottom-up ones, work together, and what happens in a wetland. I'm going to go back to Yellowstone and talk about Yellowstone a bit. So when I started my work, Yellowstone research had been, well, Yellowstone is one of the most studied systems in North America. It had been well underway. This is the Lamar River Valley. And these images were taken before wolf reintroduction in 1990. Those are willows that you see in the bottom left-hand corner. And those are willows on the right in an exclosure. So herbivores, mainly elk, there's not that many deer in that system. And there are some moose, are not able to reach those willows. And so you can see the extreme contrast between the willows that are open to being browsed and the willows that are protected. And you can also see the river, and there's no shrubs or trees growing on its banks. So Ripple and Besta published a paper in Ecology around 2003-ish, and they, you can see there, they did a repeat photograph of the same reach of the Lamar River, and the top image is before wolves, early 90s. Wolves were reintroduced in 95, 96, and the bottom image is from the early 2000s. So, and they attributed that, they correlated that to the return of wolves to that system. And those are willows. The ones in the top image are about ankle height. The ones in the bottom image are about 2 meters in height. They and others have noted trophic cascades in wetlands in Yellowstone that go from wolves, affect species like moose and elk that eat riparian vegetation, Aspen. And by controlling prey and also reducing the number of prey, that has improved resources available to beavers. Consequently, beavers have greatly increased in number. And beavers, it's a feedback loop, are creating healthier wetlands. However, there's, beavers are called the other keystone, and there are people that are noting that beaver impacts are critical, and this is a feedback loop. So we removed wolves in Yellowstone. The last wolf, I believe, was killed by the late 1920s, which at that time everybody thought that was the wisest thing to do because predators are hard to live with, are challenging at times. And beaver numbers plummeted because their habitat got wiped out by elk, which elk increased in number by 10 orders of magnitude. Anyway, what happened next was that wolves were reintroduced in 1995, 96, and beaver colonies increased from 1 in 96 to 12 in 2009. And these increases in beaver population are have been studied. They're part of long-term ecological research in that park. So they create these, beavers slow the flow of water, and that creates systems that are can support a lot of different types of organisms that a fast-flowing stream can't. This effect, this wolf effect, is called the ecology of fear, and in Yellowstone people have found that wolves kill the majority of their prey in streams and wetlands. Why that is because as the wolf is a coursing predator, it chases its prey and it runs it down, and that's an elk in that picture. You can see it has a radio collar on it, and that's part of how we have so much wonderful data on, how this ecology of fear is playing out. So when wolves hit water, they slow down, and water doesn't slow wolves down at all. So, but the elk are slowed down by water, and so they become a lot more vulnerable to wolves. And these relationships affect things like songbirds. So this is a wetland in my study area in Glacier National Park. Those are aspen. They're in a wet meadow, which means some of it is wet year-round, some of it is seasonally wet. You see that gap in the aspen ages. It coincides perfectly with the last cohort of aspen, older aspen, occurred up until when wolves were removed from that park, which again was in the 1920s. And the young cohort of aspen coincide perfectly. I cored these trees and did dendrochronology work on them with when wolves were returned to that system. Park records indicate that elk numbers became so high that they were wiping out every single sprout of aspen. And so that created what this image shows is what's called a recruitment gap. And it's a trophic cascade signature when you're dealing with wolves and elk. But Aldo Leopold also noted this sort of thing, and so did Charles Elton. The bird in the inset is an American redstart. It's a species that depends on that the understory of the forest for its nesting and feeding habitat. So when you remove an apex predator and its preferred prey removes the understory due to excessive herbivory, then you're eliminated habitat for that species. And that's an IUCN red listed species, the redstart. However, these effects are not simple. So this is Ripple and Beshta's work, more recent work in Yellowstone. They're finding that they reported in the early 2000s that riparian vegetation was recovering, and now they're reporting that it really isn't. And the situation is that elk numbers have declined, the bison numbers have gone up about an order of magnitude, and what that has done is wolves don't like to prey on bison because they're far more dangerous prey than elk are, so bison can kill a wolf very easily. So bison only comprise about 15% of wolf diet. So bison numbers have increased to the point of being unsustainable, and the park is actually culling bison now. I think they're removing 800 this year, and that's very controversial. But range conditions in that park are terrible because there's too many bison and nobody that's consistently preying on them. And even a park the size of Yellowstone is a postage stamp when it comes to an animal like a species like the bison that used to move large distances and make several hundred-mile migrations. So that's the Lamar River, and by Ripple and Beshta's assessment, it isn't really recovering to its conditions that it might have been in the early 1920s. On the other hand, there is Marshall, Cooper, and Hobbs' work where they have done experiments, and this is an LTER program. They're looking at willows, and some of you may have heard or seen that video, How Wolves Change Rivers, by environmentalist George Monbiot. It was produced in the UK. It went viral. That figure is a year old, the 17 million views. It's probably double that by now. And so they presented the wolf as saving these rivers. And what Marshall, Cooper, and Hobbs are finding is that that everybody wants to hear a good story, and that if you tell a story like wolves are saving rivers enough times, and the popular press and the public will believe it. But that doesn't mean it's true. They're finding that changes in the growth of woody species like willows in riparian areas and in wetlands can't be explained alone by wolves. For example, the growing season in Yellowstone between 1990 and today has increased by 30% because of climate change. So there's 30% more frost-free days, and willows can only really grow during that frost-free period. And that is contributing to willow growth. The increase in beavers is contributing to willow morphology. So disturbance as well and flooding regimes. And so when they created multivariate models and experimented by manipulating some of this, they found that wolves matter, but they're not the most important driver of willow ecology. Here's an exposure that Kristen Marshall has in the park, and this is part of their one of their experiments. And they found no significant difference in growth in height, for example, of the willows, but also other processes involving the willows between the willows that were exposed completely from herbivory and those that were exposed from herbivory. And they had multiple of these sites throughout the park, some in areas where there were wolves, some in areas where their wolves don't really use. So that enabled them to get a better understanding of the role of wolf presence. And they had radio collars on wolves, so they were able to measure that presence very empirically. So this raises questions. And in my own work, I had this conceptual model that is based on the basic Trophic Cascades bottom-up and top-down model. So I looked at the top-down model, which is wolves affect elk, elk affect aspen. Those are the key components in the system that I studied. And that then causes energy to cycle through the whole system. The bottom-up perspective is that the macro environment, so resources such as precipitation and soil, nutrients, and disturbance, will benefit aspen, that benefits elk, and that in turn benefits wolves, creates more resources. And I used radio-collared animals to study these effects. However, nothing is that simple. So this is an interaction web, and this is what really goes on in an ecosystem. And so what we look at, even studies such as those by Hobbs et al. In Yellowstone, is a gross simplification of these interactions in an ecosystem. So I tested 3 conceptual models: the top-down model, which is the one on the top left, the bottom-up model, which is the one on the top right, where the macro environment, so the red arrows are the factor that's the most important. And then I also looked at the trophic trickle model, and that is actually a scientific term that was created by Post, I believe. And that is when you have an apex predator, but it is not able to exert a strong top-down effect because of other interactions in that system. My study site was Waterton, Lakes National Park, Glacier National Park, 3 valleys that were ecologically similar. One of them, the St. Mary Valley, had no wolves in it. One of them had burned multiple times. The other 2 had not burned since the 1800s. So I was able to look at top-down and bottom-up effects, 3 different wolf densities. And briefly, just looking at aspen, these are aspen in a wetland. I looked at size classes of aspen. So 1 meter those are aspens that are very freely accessible to elk who can browse aspen up to the height of 2.5 meters. And this is at a wolf den, an area that the collars showed that wolves were highly active. Part of that area burned, and part of it did not burn and had not burned since the 1800s. The area that had not burned had all the other factors were the same. It's the same stand of aspen. It's just a portion of it burned and the other portion did not. And you can see the difference. So the aspen that are recruiting above the browse height of elk are only doing so in the area that had fire. And this had an ultra-high density of wolves present. So this alone suggests that it's similar to what Cooper and Hobbs found in Yellowstone, that wolves alone are not driving a trophic cascade unless other factors are present. And this is, these are the 4 age classes of aspen that I looked at. The 1 meter size, the next size are 1 meter to 2.5 meter. Those are young aspen accessible to elk, but that are starting to go through the competition phase as they prepare to enter the forest canopy. The 3rd category, those are the young pole-size aspen that have reached beyond the height that elk can browse. Recall the slide of the recruitment gap. Those are the recruiting aspen. They're the key ones to look at because that indicates a trophic cascade. And the last one is, those are senescent aspen. Those are very mature individuals. And basically, the only place I found any kind of significant recruitment was where there had been fire. So where there had been wolves the no fire, it didn't matter, and amount of moisture didn't matter, so whether it was a wetland or not a wetland did not change the amount of recruitment. So what I found was that basically a trophic trickle, that only with a very strong bottom-up factor acting together with a very strong top-down factor, wolves and fire, was there any recruitment. And that moisture and other factors did not have any effect when they were held constant. So the next steps, that work I completed in 2012. Since then, I've been playing with fire in a big way, thanks to Parks Canada and Earthwatch Institute that funds this work, Oregon State University, and the Blackfoot. So this is a prescribed fire. It's 2,300 hectares in size. Those are aspen stands. That's a wetland in there. There are 30 aspen stands in there of a variety of sizes. There's an elk density of about 25 elk per square kilometer, which is as high as anybody has ever measured anywhere, including Rocky Mountain National Park and Banff. There are two wolves in that system, two wolf packs in that system. And we are setting these fires, manipulating the fire severity in a multifactorial design. That's one of the wetlands in the fire site, so that area was burned, and the image, the inset, shows that same area as it's burning. What we found was, this is 5 years worth of data, and now we're on to our second. We're doing reburns, large-scale reburns with our next 5 years of data. When we looked at what causes aspen to recruit, we found that bottom-up and top-down effects work together, that the elements that produce greater biomass of food for elk, which is a dominant predator here by an order of magnitude, were all significant in these models. Site index being one of them, sprout density, and that increases in site index were associated with declines in elk herbivory and elk density using both collar data and herbivory data. So we're continuing to manipulate this to see if the park's objectives are to actually would like the elk to eat more aspen because they're trying to restore the grassland, which is a really, it's a biosphere reserve that contains one of the last intact patches of shortgrass prairie, of fescue prairie left in North America. So to conclude, I found that in my early work and in the work I'm doing today with a research team, that wetland ecology is influenced by both top-down and bottom-up factors, that moisture and fire moderate the indirect effects on plant communities of wolf predation, and that in a rapidly warming world, what we're doing now is essentially an ecological restoration project that is landscape scale to maintain ecological resilience. Conserving keystone predators is an effective tool, but it's not the only tool. But it's something that matters if we're trying to mitigate these changes brought on by climate change and the challenges that that causes for us in many ecosystems.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christina. That was an engaging and a very thought-provoking presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think it maybe gave me too much to think about, but that's usually a sign of a good presentation. If you're ready, and if everyone else is ready, we're going to open the question and answer period of our session. So if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the questions box. You can also pop that box out as you type if you want. And I will read the questions to Christina in the order they're submitted. And it looks like I've already got one question here from Sarah Merritt. Can everybody hear me okay, I hope? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, Christina, in the Yellowstone exclosures, what are they finding about willow growth again? Are the willows growing at the same rate inside and outside the exclosures? What are they finding?
They're finding that the willows are growing at the same rate. There's no statistically significant difference in their growth rate or their height. And so herbivory is perhaps not having as strong of an impact on them as other authors have found. And they concluded that bottom-up effects having to do with stream conditions may be more important in bottom-up effects that are influenced by beavers, and that was another aspect of their work.
Okay, great. Sarah, hopefully that'll answer your question. If not, just follow up in the questions box and I'll read your follow-up. We have another question here from Kimberly Pontio. What was the predator that kept bison in check prior to human settlement, Christina?
Prior to human settlement, wolves did prey on bison, but they've forgotten how to do that because we extirpated bison effectively extirpated them by 1860. They were down to such low numbers that it was not, that caused elk to go way up in number. So wolves had to learn how to prey on a new species. What is happening with bison in Yellowstone is that wolves are starting to prey on them more and more. So initially, if you go back 10 years, maybe 1% of wolf prey consisted of bison. Now it's up to 15%. And what park managers are expecting is that that percentage is going to continue to grow. It's just not happening fast enough to address the ecological degradation that the bison are creating in such large numbers because they're not allowed to migrate outside of the park.
Okay, great. Kimberly, I hope that answers your question. Feel free to follow up, and I'm getting some good questions here. People, please keep sending them as you think of them. So the next question here is from Tom Brightman, and this is a question actually I'd written down as well. So it must be a good question if I thought of it, right? To what extent can human hunting, deer, elk, for example, mimic the impacts that upper predators like wolves have on ecosystems?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'm a hunter. I hunt elk, and I actually hunt elk with Jim Estes and Michael Soule. We do a science hunt. So we try to, in areas where there aren't any wolves or not enough wolves, we try to exert a top-down effect by killing, we hunt female cow elk. We especially try to hunt young cow elk, which then helps reduce their numbers, and so we hunt in places like Colorado. But that was a question Aldo Leopold asked, and he didn't think that we could do the same thing that an apex predator does because we don't take the sickly and we don't take the young. So wolves prey primarily on yearling elk or elk that are, like the spike bulls. And they also prey on the elk that can't run fast enough. And human hunters tend to go out for trophies. And even those of us who try to hunt, thinking like ecologists, we're still not quite able to have the same impact that an apex predator would have.
Well, that's a great answer. I like this idea of a science hunt, and it sounds like you have good companions on those hunting trips. As a hunter, I know that I'm often not selective in a directional way. That would probably mimic things, but I oftentimes hold some hope that something like that may be possible in a very controlled situation. So I have another question here from Sarah Merritt. Did the Native American population have an effect on the bison population prior to European settlement?
Yes, they did. So, and that's some of what I'm currently studying because Native Americans set fires. And they set fires to improve, as was part of their hunting strategies, and also to improve habitat for their prey. And they hunted bison, and they would kill, in a population the size of Yellowstone, they would kill 600 of them easily in a year. A tribe, a band of Indians would. They would run them off a bison jump. And actually, in the picture I showed of the slide that had the big, massive prescribed fire, there was a bison. There are bison chutes throughout that. There's 500 archaeological sites in the area that that slide depicts. So what we're talking about doing gradually is restoring some type of, we can't go back, but we could restore some of these relationships. And in places like northeastern Montana and in Alberta, they're increasingly working on things like bison reintroduction, having free-ranging bison, and that's very controversial, and it's not, I don't know that that's necessarily feasible, but to try to restore some of this, and hunting would be part of it.
Okay, great. I had no idea that something like 600 bison was a capable kill for Native people. That's not insignificant there. Okay, if you have more questions, please keep them coming. Go ahead.
There are midden heaps that have been found, and what they would do is they would work really hard and dry all the meat, because it was feast or famine for them. As a hunter-gatherers, they didn't have agriculture, so they would dry as much meat as they could. But they found, archaeologists have found evidence that there were these mass harvests of bison that took place.
That's very impressive. Okay, well, I don't have any other questions coming in right now, but feel free to keep asking them. I'll ask a question here that I had. So how do keystone species help wetlands become more resilient to something like climate change?
Well, the slide that I showed that had the recruitment gap, and also the images I showed in the trophic downgrading, you're boosting biodiversity by what an apex predator does is it indirectly improves the plant community, habitat for other species. And that greatly boosts biodiversity. So if you have an area that has 20 species of salamanders versus one that has 2 species of salamanders, and then that wave of extinction hits that we're starting to experience today, and you lose one of those species, that's pretty devastating. Versus, if you're going to lose 50% of species and you have 20 to begin with, then that gives you a lot more to work with. So it's a numbers game in part. I think of it as insurance. Like, given what we know that wolves are not a silver bullet, or none of these other apex predators are, they're not going to fix everything. But it's having them in a system where we can, or trying to mimic their effects, like through hunting, is like a form of insurance against climate change. It buys us time as managers.
Okay. Well, as I wait to see if there's any more questions, I'll ask one more here. Oh, here's one. Here's 2. So Kimberly has asked us another one. Can you go into more depth on the reduction of species diversity and how it is tied to the phenological changes in plants? I can read that again if you need it. Maybe you can see it.
Yeah. So the plant community provides habitat, like with the sea otter. The kelp forest provides habitat for, remember that interaction web image that I showed? That's a marine food web with all of the species depicted in their interactions. So many of those species are tied to those kelp forests, and many of them are species that are, microscopic, well, almost microscopic plankton to a variety of fish, both herbivorous fish and carnivorous fish, and it just goes on and on. The amount of species that a kelp forest, it's a forest, provides habitat for. When you remove that apex predator, the sea urchins, they're the dominant herbivore in that system. They eat themselves out of house and home, literally, by removing the kelp and eating any kelp that comes up so that it's unable to grow and form a canopy, similar to what Aspen do. You're removing the habitat for all of those other species, and many of them just go away. They're especially the ones that are not generalists, the ones that have very specific habitat needs. And recall I showed an image of an American redstart. That's an example of that type of species. They just can't sustain themselves without that habitat present.
Okay, great. We have a few more questions rolling in here. Are there thresholds of biodiversity that can be observed that can give a clue as to how out of sync a given ecosystem might be?
Yes. So what we need to do is look at processes. It's not a species. It's not about individual species, but things like pollination, the type of disturbance that certain plants and certain animals have adapted to. With beavers, for example, they create structures that then change the stream flow, so changes in the hydrology. So I started out talking about processes, and really it's all about those processes. We kind of go down a slippery slope when we focus on a single species or certain numbers of species, because there's so many factors that go into systems. And the system where I work gets 3 times the amount of precipitation than Yellowstone does. It's a wet system. It's an Aspen prairie system, but it's very wet in comparison. So the numbers there and the dynamics there are going to be different, but really focusing on those processes and ensuring that they're functioning, and then monitoring certain key species, not all of the species, but looking for indicator species, such as pollinators, for example, that are drivers of those processes.
Okay, it looks like Tom kind of followed up on that one, and I guess he was trying to clarify. He says, I'm thinking of an applied approach for land managers rather than a formal experimental approach. Does that give any change of thought to your answer there, or?
Yeah, so that's what we're doing in Alberta. Parks Canada has, is spending millions of dollars on this program, but that's not sustainable. That's not a solution. And so what they are asking us to do, and this is what we're tasked with, is to find a subset of indicators that managers can clue in on to then enable them to make it. So this is adaptive management. So that's our next step, is to create an adaptive management strategy for them that is cost effective. And so yes, we're doing experimental work, but the experimental work will give us empirical findings that will then be used to create an adaptive management strategy that will be simple and inexpensive to apply. The other key thing that we are doing for the work that we're doing in Waterton that's funded by Earthwatch is we're using citizen science. So we are creating methods that anybody can apply that therefore will be really inexpensive to keep going, and engaging citizen scientists in this work is has a lot of benefits for managers on many levels because you're getting community buy-in for science and management.
Okay, great. Here's another one from Kimberly. Wouldn't there be examples of where species diversity could increase with changes in vegetation communities with climate change?
Yes, of course there would be. And this is, this gets at novel ecosystems. And in fact, where people have found that when you clear cut a forest, sometimes clear cuts contain greater diversity than old growth forest. So ecology is a tangled bank, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to everything. And so biodiversity we are still arguing about what it means, let alone how to measure it. And climate change is making that more challenging because there are places where biodiversity goes up as the environment becomes degraded. So there is a debate about biodiversity. However, we should not be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and the scientific debates are, get into a lot of theory, and in the meantime, this climate change business, it's happening so rapidly that we can't afford to discard any tools that we have in our toolbox.
Okay, thanks, Christina. I think the questions have maybe stopped coming in for now, and that's good timing on everyone's part. So unless something else comes in here in just a minute, I'm going to move us on here. I sure do appreciate your wonderful talk. Everybody is clapping, I'm sure, virtually for you. That was really wonderful. Okay, upcoming webinar.
Thank you, Josh. And
go ahead. You're very welcome.
Thank you for your help with this. You did a great job moderating this session.
Thank you very much. And there's several people that have typed in the question box. Thank you for doing such a good job. Enjoyed it, found it very valuable along with your books, things like that. So SWS, I'm sure, is very proud to have your involvement. And I tell you, you've given me a lot to chew on mentally for a while. Okay, so upcoming webinars. Please mark your calendars for the next webinar in the SWS webinar series, April's webinar, Climate Change in the Future of Blue Carbon. We presented at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're interested in presenting an SWS webinar or have a topic of interest you would like to see us cover, please indicate this in the evaluation survey you'll receive at the conclusion of the webinar, or contact SWS headquarters. So thanks again, Christina, for taking time out of your busy schedule to present an SWS webinar. And thanks to our audience for attending today's webinar and for asking some really great questions. And we look forward to your participation in the upcoming webinar. So with that, thanks so much, everyone.